Greetings hobbyists, this is Arsanzavul, and in this video I'm going to have a talk through my workflow process for when making 3D printable objects that are going to be added to miniatures. So this is going to focus on the Jetpack that's currently on the screen, and I will come out straight away and say that I haven't actually recorded every single stage of this. I'm going to be looking at some saved files, but this should give you a really good idea of what I do and the order I do it in, and if people want it, I'm more than happy to do a longer video at some point where I actually go through and make something fully, or at least do some speeded up footage and then can talk through what I'm doing as I'm doing it. So do let me know in the comments. So the first stage that I normally go into is putting in what I refer to as the non-negotiables. Now in some instances these are very simple. It might be just something that's going to reference scale. So if I was making something for say Adeptus Titanicus, I might bring in a cylinder that's going to represent the height of a person, so that would be 6mm, something like that, and then I've just got that representing the size of what a human should be, and that's therefore going to give me a good idea of what scale I'm doing. Or if I was doing something such as a 40mm base, I might bring in something that's a 40mm base, so 40mm, but its radius, so divided by 2, and that's going to give me the size of this base, and that's going to give me something to work off of. The other thing that I often do is I might bring in something like a cube. So for example, if I have a limited size that I'm going to work in, and I'll press something like N, bring out the sizes, and I'll just change the dimensions to whatever it needs to be. For example, 10 by 35, and then something like 6 high. And I've got this cube there to represent the dimensions that I have to fit my object inside. And that's quite useful as just a guide. Normally I will hide that fairly regularly, so I'll just keep it hidden and then just show it, and I'll normally rename it. Now in the instance of this project, I actually had very different non-negotiables, and that was because this part was going to connect to another. So what I did is I actually made something that's going to be the connector. So this is representing the connecting point of the model that I need to attach it to. And then I had an approximate size of the bit that was going to attach to this, so I made that cube and then reshaped it, keeping the height, and this was measured out here, of how tall that needs to be. And then my final non-negotiable was that there was another object that I had to avoid, which is effectively the cowl of the armor that this is going to attach to, and I made this block to represent that. Now if I just bring this to the side, you can see a video now of where that came in. So you've got the connector that was attaching to the back, and the cube is representing the back of the armor, sort of the bit that's protecting the neck, and you can see here where those would go. Now what that means is that this cube is never going to become part of the model, and this connector is actually going to get deleted from the model at some point, but I don't do that until the very end. In fact, that is the last thing that I do, is delete that out. Now at this point I start making the bit that I've thought out most for the object. So this is going to be the main top of the jetpack. So the air intake that basically powers it or gives it fuel for combustion. And I will say this is where other people probably differ from me on two fronts. The first is I don't draw sketches most of the time before I make a model. Now there'll be some people that are going to shout about that and think that it's always a really good idea to do that first. And to be honest, I totally agree with them. It is a good idea to sketch out the model and what you want to do first. It's just that, well, I am awful at drawing, and if I did that, it would just waste my time and it wouldn't be any good to me. Now, this does mean that I go through things in a slightly different way for some other people. For example, most people's workflow at this point would be to add in all of the major shapes here to get themselves started. Yet I do something slightly different. I normally pick the point that I've visualized most, so in this instance it was this section, which is going to be the top, and then I actually start adding detail to this, which most people would say that is the wrong thing to do. You block out all the shapes, then you start adding the detail. However, for me, I find that adding detail to one point is really useful. So in this instance, I cut out this shape here, which allows this cube to be seen, which is going to be the back point, so I need to keep that in mind. And then I started adding in the vents, and I've got that here. So these were just booleaned in, and you'll notice that they're not confirmed. In fact, I don't apply them until the very end, but I like to do that because it gives me, again, another thing that shows a sense of scale. And you'll notice I don't really detail anything else after this point until I get to the main detailing, but having one bit that's quite detailed I find very useful. Though if you are good at sketching, you might find that this is a totally irrelevant stage, and some people wouldn't follow this workflow and would argue that this is the wrong thing to do at this stage. Each to their own. Maybe give it a try and see what you feel. So I'm just going to jump forward to another save file now, and at this point I've started to add a little bit more detail here. So I've added this extra armor part to the top, and I've extended this out because it's going to be important for the other shapes. And at this point I just start bulking out the major other shapes, and that's going to be the main parts or the main exhaust of this jetpack, which is going to have two major exhausts here. You'll notice that I do this in a lot of separate parts. So for example, I've got all of these separated still. Nothing's been boolean together because I still want to be able to move them apart. And at this point, this has got a mirror modifier, so it's mirroring it to the other side. I will say I did something a bit stupid here in terms of detailing that I wanted to add later, but that was kind of necessary because of wanting to get these in place. So I have actually made things a little bit difficult here where these aren't actually on the X and the Y axis, and stupidly I applied the rotation. What are you going to do? There's ways around that, and I will talk about that later. Now with that done, I have started to add a little bit more detailing again. You'll notice that I've filled in some of the holes here, and I've made this shape flow more. So you can see that that's got this area here, which is going to be where the shoulder pad of the model is going to go, but also it just adds some nice smooth lines that makes everything work a little bit better. And I start bringing in some additional detailing of the piping that's going to be here, and I've started to add in the details on these cylinders where there's going to be major points. So this line here, nothing was going to affect that panel line, and these areas where the exhaust is going to be, again, nothing was going to affect it, so it was worth having that in, and again, that indent gives a sense of scale. So then I started adding this piping in, which appears to be some sort of stability or something that adds rigidity to the frame. And again, I wanted this because I wanted to know the thickness of these different objects, get them in place, and it allowed me to move these cylinders so that this fit nicely in the center. So this was important. Although it feels like detail, it was important for the positioning of these main objects. So it was a sensible point to come next. It also helped me decide on where the armor was going to be, that was going to be on the back of this jetpack. So that was going to be the next stage. So at this point, I start adding in that back armor. These are all individual parts. So we've got individual parts here, here, and here. They are actually the same shape originally that I then move around and start changing the shape of them slightly. For example, making this wider as you move up. And then you'll see why this was so important to have this object here, because now I've managed to fit that in behind and make sure there's a gap. So I actually moved this slightly out in front. You could argue that I could have done these panels first and then added this in second, and essentially neither of those options would have been particularly wrong, but I liked to have this shape in here because it gave me an idea of how thick this was going to be. And this is actually still a curve, and you can see here I've got my geometry and I've changed that depth to 0.7 millimeters, and that was a really quick way of getting a very specific size. You can see I can still change that. Let's just undo that. And that meant that when I did this, I had a good idea of how large I wanted these arm panels to be, because I have, again, that reference point of scale. So potentially a difference here to if I was doing this for CG work, where I'd do the panels first and this second. I knew the thickness that I wanted of this object, so I did the piping first, knowing that thickness, and then did the armor paneling afterwards, because the tubing gave me an idea of the size that this should be, and it gave me something to relate it to. Now at this point I've started adding more detailing. I've added in the rivets and put those on the armor panels, and I've added some additional thicker bits here that are going to be part of this object, and then I can start booleaning those together at a later date. You'll notice that I still haven't applied this, which is the connector point. As I said, that's going to be the last thing to do. But now that I've finalized what I've wanted to do here, I've taken out the cube. In fact, I think I'd done that earlier. And I start adding detailing to this top bit. In actual fact, in this save file, I've just realized that this doesn't show the last part. So let me just add that in there so it's symmetrical. But you will notice that I do a lot of saving between different stages. I find it very useful for going back and changing things. As I said, I don't sketch this out, so all of these little objects being individual is kind of like my sketch. I put things together and see how they work, and I move things around, add bits to it, and then might decide that I need to go back and change something. But you can see it works out quite well when you do this sketching method in Blender itself. It's quite nice. We have got some slight overlap here. That's only because I haven't booleaned everything together, and then I'll fix that up. But again, everything's being kept as separate individual shapes, so I can keep moving and changing things as I want to, as part of almost an ongoing sketching process. And here we get to our final details. So at this point, I've booleaned everything together, and you'll see that everything's joined. You'll notice that I've added the final bits of detail here, which with the thruster exhaust, I've got these little details here to the power pack. And I will say this was the point where I suddenly realised where I'd applied the rotation, and actually that's not too much of a pain. If you just go into face mode and select the face and press Shift and 7, what that will do is that will actually align you to a face, so you can still start bringing in objects or using things like box cutter to cut out these different sections, and that's not going to be a problem. So that Shift and 7 on the number pad is really useful for basically fixing any mistakes or wanting to get head on to a specific face. And then finally, you'll notice that this is the point where I do the final cutout of this connector. So that has only happened at this point, and interestingly, that was the first thing that I brought in, and it was the last thing that I cut out, which I always recommend doing when you're making something like a file that's going to be an add-on part to a miniature. The main reason for that is that essentially I've got the file saved up until this point, with the only bit different being this connector piece was not cut out, and that means that when I do my test print, I can find out, well no, actually that connector's in the wrong place, and I can just move it slightly if I need to tweak it by a couple of millimeters. Or the other thing that this is really useful for, though this is probably less of a problem for me, is that if I don't have my printer really dialed in, while that connector point was accurate, I might decide that because I slightly overexposed my models, if I haven't got my printer dialed in, that I need to make this maybe a couple of tenths of a millimeter bigger. So it's really useful having that part done last. So that was a very quick walkthrough of my sort of design process. Again, I apologise for this not being something that I can show you as I go along, but hopefully those save files have made it clear what I do at each point. And as I said, if people would like something where I go through something like a larger project and have some speeded up footage of what I'm doing, which I could stop at points, I'd be happy to do that. It's just I don't do it for most of my main projects, mostly because I'm working on a laptop, and having the recording functioning at the same time as I'm doing things like booleans does slow my computer down a little bit. At some point I will have the money to buy a better computer, but that day is not today. As always, if you found that interesting, please do give this video a like. It helps other people see it and then helps the channel get a little bit bigger, which is always really nice to see. And if you've got any questions, do feel free to ask them in the comments section, and I'll happily get back to you as soon as I can.